and panelists, attendees.
Okay, so let's get started. Welcome everyone. My name is Joseph Chirigian. I'm a professor here at SIS, and I'm running the Political Violence and Security Cluster this year. Before we begin, I wanted to plug another event that we're having on November 12th at 11 a.m. Professor Joe Young, who's at both SIS and SPA, will moderate a talk with Professor Phil Potter from UVA, who will present his book, China's War on Terror, Repression and Violence on the New Silk Road. So our moderator for today's event is SIS PhD student Min Kim, whose fields are political violence and international relations, which she both passed with distinction. And her dissertation is explaining territorial control and state building in highland peripheries of India and Myanmar. So we can see why she's such a perfect person to moderate this event. Min, please go ahead.
Okay. So thanks, Joseph, and I'd like to thank Joseph and PVS for inviting me to discuss Shiv's fascinating book with Cambridge UP. I've been waiting for this book to come out since our path crossed at Humble Archives in New Delhi a few years ago, and I was very excited to read it over the late summer. For those who haven't gotten his book yet, I hope today's platform offers a good opportunity to review his previous book, and I hope you can get them eventually. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Shivaji Mukherjee. Shivaji is a assistant professor in political science in the University of Toronto, and was a visiting fellow at the Krog Institute for Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame in 2018 and 2019. He specialized in the role of colonial institutions in the causes and trajectories of political violence and civil conflict in South Asia, especially focusing on India. In addition to his new book with Cambridge UP, he wrote numerous articles on the subjects, published in JCR, War Development, Asian Security, Civil War, and so on and so forth. So today's session is going to be that Shiv will deliver his book presentation, and I will respond briefly with 1 or 2 questions, depending on time we would have. And I will open up the discussion with the audience for the remaining time. So Shiv, and I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Min. Thanks so much for introducing me and for agreeing to be discussing for my book. I can't imagine someone being a better discussant given your expertise, especially on state formation and colonialism in the northeast of India and Myanmar. Also like to start by thanking Joseph for offering me this opportunity to present my book talk at the PVS cluster at SIS American University. So thanks a lot, Joseph, and hopefully we can keep engaging after this and have about like topics of interest. So the topic, maybe I should I share my screen for the PowerPoint? I'll try doing that. Let me know if it's working. There you go, share. Can you guys see it? And can? Okay, great. So the topic for actually I need to go to the very first slide. And just 1 sec. Thank you for bearing with me. Okay, so I hope you can see the screen. So the topic for today's book talk is on colonial institutions and civil war, and it's also called Indirect Rule, Maoist Insurgency in India. And this is the top. This book is basically based on my dissertation on which I did fieldwork in India, and later on did some more archival research. And the particular case which I study is the Maoist insurgency in India, and I realize it may not be a particular topic which is or a case which is very familiar with audiences in North America. So maybe I'll start by talking briefly about it. So, for example, this is a picture which I use on the cover of my book. It was given by a journalist. It shows actually a woman carver deep inside the tribal forest areas in Chhattisgarh somewhere. We don't know exactly where, but it kind of symbolizes a long-lasting revolutionary leftist insurgency, which we often call the Maoist insurgency. But there are various splinter groups which use different kinds of ideology, Marxism, Leninism, etc., etc. Some of them use different kind of Maoist ideology, and it goes to show that while Maoism may be dead in China, to some extent, it is still alive and kicking in its neighboring democracy in India. And to give you a little bit of a brief history of the insurgency, it actually started in a small village called Naxalbari. I don't think chat is on, otherwise I would type in Naxalbari, N-A-X-A-L-B-A-R-I, and that's why some of these Maoists used to be also known as Naxalites or Naxals in common journalistic media. And it started in 1967. There was a revolutionary outbreak. spread to certain parts of India, especially in the eastern and southern parts. And by 1973, I think this first phase was more or less crushed by the central and certain provincial governments. And following this, many of the leaders were killed, they were jailed, but some of them re-emerged, and there was a lot of ideological re-splintering. Around the early 1980s, we see some of these groups re-emerge in the states of Bihar, in the northeast, and then Andhra Pradesh in the south, which I shall talk about hopefully in the next few slides. And many of these Maoists, they claim to fight for the role for like various subaltern ethnic groups like lower castes or Dalits and tribes or indigenous groups and Adivasis. And the violence really increased. I think around 2004, two of the most powerful groups, the Maoist Communist Center and the People's War Group Unified, came together to form the Unified Communist Party of India, Maoist, and violence really started escalating. And that was the period of the highest level of violence, 2004, 2014, 15. Since then, the violence level has gone down, but it continues to be one of India's longest lasting insurgencies even today. So I'm going to move on to my book, and this is a question which really motivated my dissertation and continue to motivate my book. And there are two empirical puzzles which I want to note in this picture. So on the left, if you can see it, there's a rough approximate. You don't have to take it. You should take it with a grain of salt because it is a media image. Say taken around 2007 or 8 at the peak period of Maoist expansion, and it continued to expand till 2010, 11, 12, 13. And the media is to sensationalize and call it the red corridor, which stretches. I'm going to try to use my laser pointer if I can. Yeah. So they would say, oh, there's the Maoists, there's this red corridor in the world's largest democracy, stretching all the way from Nepal in the north through these districts all the way to the south of India. And the puzzle really which motivated me is, why is it that this, what the media calls the red corridor and what the Maoists call the compact revolutionary zone, why is it concentrated along the central eastern part of India? Why not in other parts of India, in the west, in the south, which also have some levels of poverty, which have different indigenous groups like tribes, different types of tribes and lower castes, so Dalits staying there. And the second interesting thing here is that there seem to be these two epicenters of the insurgency. So in the north, or rather the northern, it's not as northeast as the place which Min studies over here, but you could still see it's in the eastern side of India. You see that you historically have a Maoist group called the MCC, or the Maoist Communist Center, which was strong, though there were many other splinter groups and continue to be. And those of you who know a little bit of India, these are along the neighboring districts of the states of West Bengal here, then Bihar over here, the central plains of Bihar, and northern parts of Jharkhand. And earlier under the British, this used to be Bengal province once upon a time. And then you have the southern epicenter of the insurgency along the southern districts of the state of Chhattisgarh over here. I apologize, this map does not have the state boundaries as clearly over here, but I'll try to show you over here, like this is the southern district of Chhattisgarh. These are the northern districts of what used to be called the state of Andhra Pradesh, and today it has been formed, split into two different states, and some of the southwestern districts of Orissa. And here, historically, the PWG, or the People's War Group, was the strongest Maoist faction. And in order to engage with this puzzle, I started engaging with scholarship in civil war, as many of you, I guess, in the PVS cluster are interested in and are experts on this kind of literature. There are various scholars like Jim Fearon and David Layton, Collier and Heufler, others are canonists, etc., and who would suggest that it's not ethnic grievances. Grievances are ubiquitous. It's not grievances of different sorts which could be really used to predict insurgency, right? It's the opportunity to rebel, which could be measured in various ways. It could be access to natural resources. It could be hilly terrain or forest cover. And it is true, if you look at this map on the left of India, Indian forest cover, I don't exactly know which year this is, but it probably hasn't changed too much, say probably around 2001. If you look at the state of Chhattisgarh over here, which we're going to talk about in more detail later today, it is true that the southern districts of Chhattisgarh here, the southern districts are some of the strongest areas of Maoist rebel control. These are the few areas where they still have almost base areas. It is difficult to travel there. However, if you just were to look at the left of it, in the larger state of Madhya Pradesh, out of which we can very faintly see the outline here, out of which the state of Chhattisgarh was created through state reorganization in the year 2000. There are forests there too. For example, there's a well-known forest reserve of Kanha and Kisli. And if you wanted to do some ecotourism in India, you could go there, you will see Bengal tigers and get onto elephants and have fun. You're probably not going to see too many Maoists. And similarly, if you look at the South Indian state of Karnataka over here, I have data, and I've analyzed this in a later chapter in the book, which shows that the Maoists did try to be successful in this area called the Malna, the region in Karnataka, and all along the western coast of India, you have this hilly ridge area called known as the Western Ghats. And this is also forested, and here the Maoists were not successful here. Similarly, the plains of Bihar, the Maoists have been very successful here, the MCC, but there are no forest cover. So yeah, forest covers are very important, but they're neither necessary nor really sufficient. And then moving on to another, engaging with other theorists, Deadger, or more recently, Lars Erik Siderman, and many others who would say that ethnic grievances or relative deprivation does matter. If you engage with them, it seems that they are probably more correct. And it is true that areas in India, if you were to use any kind of census data on public good provisions or kind of caste inequalities, you would find that these southern districts in Chhattisgarh are some of the most, and in Orissa are really poor. That's where you have the stronghold of the Maoists in the southern epicenter. And of course, it is well known by scholars of India. I think maybe Adam is here, so he can tell you even better than I can, because he studies patronage politics, that Bihar, Jharkhand, these areas historically have been the poorest in India. And so, of course, that does help explain why the Maoists are successful here. And yet again, if you were to go to the western state of Rajasthan bordering Pakistan, there are different kinds of tribals staying there, and they also have lower levels of development and public good provision, and yet no Maoists. So the broad point, if you had to realize when I was initially thinking of this question, is that it's true that the usual measures of different kinds of ethnic inequalities and land inequalities, and the usual explanations in civil war onset theories or weak state capacity or access to opportunities are definitely part of the causal pathway. And yet they do not provide a complete, full, holistic explanation of this peculiar spatial variation. And to really understand this complete spatial variation, what we need to do is focus on, we need to really look back into the histories of British colonial histories and maybe even pre-colonial histories to explain this entire spatial variation in India. And focusing more broadly on the colonial legacies literature, what I want to point out is that as scholars of civil war or rebellion, it would be nice and it would be useful if we actually analyze the effects of colonial or even other kinds of colonial institutions, not just direct indirect rule, which I study, and how they create the subnational variation in state capacity, subnational variation in levels of development and inequalities, which then become the causal, which then become the more proximate factors used to usually explain civil war or insurgency by most scholars of rebellion or insurgency. And I think there are various advantages to including colonial institutions, which I'll talk about in more detail later. One of them is that it actually removes a certain amount of endogeneity or omitted variable bias, which exists, especially in the cross-national data set-based analysis of insurgency or civil war. Now, focusing on the Indian case, back in the Maoist case, what I essentially find is that the different kinds of colonial legacies of direct and indirect rule through princes and zamindars or landlords, and these areas in India, which had these different forms of indirect rule, tended to, on average, have a weaker state capacity, and they also had different kinds of lower castes or tribes staying there who suffer from land and natural resource exploitation and had grievances. And post-Indian independence in 1947, once the British left, these Maoist rebels were able to actually create successful Maoist rebellion in those areas where they had these historically created ideal conditions, what I term as, using language from social movements theory, political opportunity structures in the form of weak state capacity, and ethnic mobilization networks in the form of these lower castes or tribes with grievances, right? And so I want to step back here and explain what do I mean specific to the Indian case. What do I mean by these different forms of direct and indirect rule? And maybe as we are going through the Indian case, you can think of other cases in other parts of the world. And I would love to hear from the audience about how this broad generalized concept of direct and indirectness of rule can generalize to other parts of the world, maybe in Latin America or maybe in Africa. So in India, what happened is, so for example, basically in India, as many of you already know, not only in India, but in other parts of the world, the British arrived as traders, as part of the British East India Company. This is much before the British Crown officially took over in 1856. And so they were given these small areas of sanads by the Mughal emperor. They would have small pockets of influence of forts and ports along the coast. But the first real chunk of territory that the British really conquered in India and put into what was a more formal type of direct rule, where they replicated the European institutions in India, was in the eastern part of India. So if I want to go back a few slides, it was here in Calcutta. You see the port of Calcutta here. This was very profitable. And this is where, under the leadership of Lord Clive, the British were able to defeat the Nawab of Bengal in the Battle of Plassey in 1757. And that's what the picture is showing you, However, and here, of course, and as time went on, the British from 1757, they kept conquering in different areas in India along the coast and western areas into officially direct rule, where they implemented European institutions of police, bureaucracy, judiciary, etc. And yet what we see is that because of the extremely large size of the country, the extremely high population density, the complexities, social and cultural complexities, the British were often forced to sign various kinds of treaties of indirect rule with various kinds of native princes. And you can see some examples here, some Nizams, Rajas, Nawabs, etc., because, and they would basically, and in these native princely states, they're often called native states or princely states, they had a lot of internal autonomy in terms of culture or in terms of religion, etc. But in terms of external affairs or in terms of warfare or economic affairs, they would often sign treaties of subsidiary alliance to the British. And this group, I call it the more formal kind of indirect rule. And both economists like Lakshmi Iyer as well as historians like Lee Warner would accept this is the more formal kind of indirect rule that we understand. Now I'm going to introduce a conceptual wrinkle or an innovation. And maybe if you're a South Asian historian, you may or may not agree with me here. And what I'm going to suggest is that even in certain areas of India, for example, in Bengal, that eastern part, which I showed you earlier, where the British initially annexed officially into direct rule, because of the extremely large size of the country and for other reasons, the British still depended on pre-existing native intermediaries called landlords or zamindars. And for the word zamin basically means land and zamindar means landlord, to do the land revenue collection on their behalf. And this was a more indirect form of land revenue collection system. So for example, maybe I'm the British, I'm Lord Cornwallis or whoever in 1792, and I go to this village and I see like Min is there and she's a well-known rich upper caste landlord. So I say, hey, Min, can you please help me out here and do some of the land revenue collection, because you're familiar with the culture, the tribes, you already are well ensconced and established over there. And Min will go and do the revenue collection. She will give me a certain percentage which is fixed. And of course, is not a good example because she's a nice person, so she will not exploit the peasants who are even lower caste. But often many of the low caste peasants who are low castes, this will lead to land inequality. Can you hear me? I can see that my internet connection is shown. Can you guys hear me? The internet connection.
Your connection is a little bit spotty.
Yep, I think it just showed that unstable. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, thank you. So maybe I should not criticize the landlords in India too much. So essentially what it created is created higher levels of not only land inequality, but intercaste inequality. And there are scholars like Atul Kohli and Matthew Lang who've worked on direct indirect rule who suggest that you can think of this as a different shade of indirect rule. I like to call it indirect revenue collection system. And both these areas can be compared with other areas in India. So if you go back to that map, so for example, the Bombay presidency here, which later became Maharashtra, or the Madras presidency in the south over here. And these were areas where the British not only officially annexed into direct rule, but they later on used a more form of revenue collection system, or sometimes the Mahalwari system. And the word Rayot is present, and the idea is now I would create an army of administrators or tax collectors who would go to the villages and collect revenue more directly from the Rayots or the peasants. And this was a more relatively egalitarian form of land revenue system, created less land inequality. Also, there was higher administrative capacity and bureaucratic capacity, which was built up. And as a consequence, there was probably less Maoist insurgency or agrarian rebellions in these areas. So essentially, if I want to cut a long story short, what I'm going to suggest is that areas in India which had these different forms of direct, formal and informal indirect rule created more extraction, more inequality, weaker development, weaker state capacity. And I'm going to try to prove that the through path-dependent mechanisms, these differences persisted into the post-colonial period. So I don't know how I'm doing in terms of time, but this is actually a very complicated this looks very complicated, but this slide allows me to pull together the different aspects of my theoretical framework, which I've been talking about. Actually, I'll walk you through it. If you have questions, I'll be happy to take any questions, but actually it's not very complicated. So if you can bear with me. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that there are at least two causal pathways to Maoist insurgency in India. So if you look at the map on the left, which I've shown you earlier, the first causal pathway coincides with the northern epicenter, which I talked about in Bihar, Jharkhand, and West Bengal. And here, historically, the British initially introduced the zamindari or landlord tenure system. And it created high levels of land inequalities and caste inequalities for the mechanisms which I explained earlier, and also to some extent weak state capacity. There's an article by Alex Lee, who also works on colonial legacies in South Asia, who shows that areas in the zamindari land tenure systems here are relatively weaker in terms of state capacity, bureaucrat, police capacity, and tax capacity as compared to areas over here which were under Ayatwari system. Then I suggest that the second causal pathway to Maoist insurgency in India coincides roughly with this southern epicenter of the insurgency, where historically you had the small princely states of feudatory states in Bastar, in Chhattisgarh area, and Orissa, and then you had a very large princely state of Hyderabad in the northern part of Andhra Pradesh. And here you have different kinds of mechanisms. So for example, in Chhattisgarh and Orissa, you had a lot of different alienated indigenous tribes staying here, and they were often exploited of the natural resources as well as the land revenues by the British by using these princes or rajas, who were often ethnic outsiders. And in the case of Hyderabad, you also had land inequality, very similar to in the northern epicenter. And what I'm going to suggest here, and this is the interesting and controversial part, is that in 1947, the British leave India and Pakistan. India and Pakistan become independent. Nehru gives his big speech, etc., etc. That's all great. And by 1950s, many of these princes and zamindars are officially abolished. That's one of the few land reforms the Congress party in control of India could actually pull off. And so what we would expect is that those districts in India, which have been under different forms of indirect rule, and those slowly merge or converge in terms of levels of development, in terms of levels of intercaste inequality, with those areas in India which had been under various kinds of direct rule. And yet what I find, at least in these parts of India, if not others, is that through different kinds of sticky path-dependent processes, which I hope to elucidate through the case of Chhattisgarh later today in the talk, many of these areas continued to have high levels of land inequality and grievances amongst lower caste and tribes, also certain levels of weak police and bureaucratic capacity. And as a consequence, when the new generation of Maoist leaders re-emerged in the 1980s with these ideological frames of rebellion in their head, they found it much more easy to create successful Maoist rebellion in these areas which historically had been exposed to different forms of indirect rule, and they found it more difficult to create successful rebellion, even though they tried in some of these areas which had been formally exposed to different kinds of direct rule, and therefore had lower level of land equality and higher levels of development. So in a nutshell, that essentially is the theoretical part of my argument. And I have certain scope conditions, which maybe I can talk about in more detail in the Q&A, but I just wanted to flag at the beginning that people often ask me, can your theoretical framework based on colonial legacies explain patterns of violence today? And the answer is no, it's not really intended to do that. It's only intended to explain the initial phase of insurgency once it starts off, because after that, lots of environmental factors, a lot of international factors start playing a role. So I'm going to move on here, and I'm going to move more to the empirical part of the analysis. And we have 25 minutes already. Oops. So maybe if I can quickly borrow 10 minutes. So I use mixed method, various kinds of qualitative and quantitative method, and I use the nested analysis, which I'll describe here. So I start off, and this is a kind of method of analysis which most of the scholars, whether Tariq Fachil or Adam Morbach or many others, have preferred to use in more recent comparative politics analysis of not only insurgency, but various types of politics in India. And so in chapters 5 and 6, I essentially depend on this all India district level data set on Maoist rebel control. And here I try to show in broad strokes, I try to show that I test my theory on a quantitative data set to show that my different forms of indirect rule actually do have correlation with Maoist insurgency. I actually have a standalone chapter, which I've never really presented. Maybe I'm happy to talk about it, but actually does qualitative analysis of Maoist documents at an all India level. But more broadly, within this quantitative analysis, I have focused on the two states in that southern epicenter of the insurgency, the state of Chhattisgarh and the state of Andhra Pradesh, which talked about. And you can think of these two states as nested within this all India analysis. And here I use various kinds of qualitative archival data, fieldwork data, to actually trace these causal pathways and show that they actually persist through path dependence into the 1970s and 1980s in these two states. And today, I hope I can talk about the case of Chhattisgarh in the little time I have left, and maybe briefly talk about the all India district level data set. So quickly, about the all India district level data set, I want to point out that actually there's a lot of good articles which have come out on the Maoist insurgency, which use quantitative analysis based on district level data sets. One of the best analyses of Maoist insurgency, one of the best data sets is by Davis Kapoor. He was at Cassie UPenn. And however, none of them focus on colonial legacies. And also one of the ways in which my study or my book is distinct from these articles is that while most of these articles focus on violence as a most visible aspect of insurgency, I focus on rebel control. And I'm basically borrowing here from Stathis Kalivas, who has suggested that rebel control is much more comprehensive concept of trying to get at the underlying actual level of control which rebels have in an area. And this could be mismeasured if you only rely on violence. And the media often misses violent events. And there are various other reasons how my data set is, how my book is different. For example, most of these scholars focus on district level data sets. I use both district level as well as sub-district level data sets in the states of Andhra and Chhattisgarh. So my dependent variable of Maoist control essentially is collected from this Ministry of Home Affairs security related expenditure scheme, which is basically a counterinsurgency scheme used by the Indian central government to fund many of the provincial governments for their counterinsurgency expenditures. And for my two measures of formal indirect rule to princely state, I measure that through the Imperial Gazetteers of India, of which there are 26 volumes. The 26th volume, I think, has all these maps. And I use a 0-1 measure of this, but I also have a more continuous measures of this as robustness tests. And for my more informal kind of indirect rule through landlord zamindari land tenure system, I rely on Lord Baden-Powell's well-known official version of land tenure systems of British India, which is over here, and which has been used by a well-known article by Abhijit Banerjee and Lakshmi Iyer in the. They have a famous article which I'll talk about, where they analyze the effects of land tenure system, not on Maoist insurgency, but on development. And then I have various controls drawn from the Census of India. For example, I have land inequalities, access to various kinds of public goods from the Census of India, measures of rebel opportunity like forest cover elevation from forest survey. And these are the usual measures which scholars of civil war would use to try and predict insurgency. And very quickly, if you look at the OLS analysis, so for example, here my dependent variable is that rough 0-1 binary measure of Maoist control. And in model 2, where I've included state fixed effects because different states in India have different cultural and historical qualities, and controlling for all these things like percentage costs, access to forest, access to public goods, forest cover, we do find that roughly that both princely state and zamindari land tenure system do have a statistically significant and positive correlation with Maoist insurgency. So it gives me some level of comfort. And initial broad strokes testing of my theory, but there are big challenges of causal inference to this theory. And the first one, as you can already guess, is selection effects, and it's possible that the British intentionally selected those districts for indirect rule, which were difficult to govern because of hilly, forested terrain, etc. And there's also the other problem is that while I've actually already outlined 2 types of indirect rule, there's probably even more further variation between these types of indirect rule, and I address both of these in chapter 6. Let's see if I have time. Maybe I can quickly go through the selection issue very briefly, and I don't think I'll be able to go to the other issue, but I can take it up in the Q&A session because I want to actually move on to the qualitative analysis of the case of Chhattisgarh. But I want to actually quickly address the issue of selection bias because this is a big issue. And as I already hinted at, suppose you were a British administrator and you were looking at, and these areas in pink are the areas you annexed into direct rule, and these areas in yellow are the various small and large princely states. You have some really large states like Kashmir and Hyderabad, and some really small states like Bastar and some you can't even see here. Say focusing on the state of Mysore here in South India, which I've expanded up. It's entirely possible that you chose this area into indirect rule because they were very difficult to rule tribes over there, or the soil quality was poor, or the potential was very low, and which means the pre-colonialist qualities of these regions or districts are what caused rebellion in the first place, and my regression estimates are biased upward. I've tried to control this in various ways. I've used comparative case study, and in this comparative case study, I've tried to choose 2 cases which are very similar, for example, and I've also tried to use an instrumental variable regression, which is more of a quantitative strategy. I don't think I'll have much time to go through the qualitative case study, but briefly, for example, I've chosen 2 cases of Awadh and Hyderabad. Awadh in the north, ruled by the Nawab of Awadh; Hyderabad in the south, ruled by the Nizam of Hyderabad. Both very large princely states, relatively both very economically powerful, both near centers of British power. Awadh is near Bengal, Hyderabad was near Madras presidency, both ruled by Muslim states. Oops, I think my internet connection is showing to be unstable again. I think my internet was unstable again. Can you hear me again now?
I can hear you.
Okay. And what I'm trying to show here is that while Lord Dalhousie in 1856, who was a very known and controversial Governor General in India, did want to annex both Awadh and Hyderabad. In 1850, if you look at the map, Awadh turns from green to pink, that is, it is annexed to direct rule, while Hyderabad remains green and continues to remain green and a princely state till Indian independence in 1947. And I try to point out its historical contingencies related to external geostrategic circumstances, which actually prevented the British from being as selective. So the big point I'm trying to make here using these case studies is that it is true that the British were selective, but there are various geostrategic considerations and other external contingencies which prevented them from being selective all the time. I'll also address the selection issue by creating these instruments. I don't think I have much time to go through it, so maybe I'll skip over it. And but basically to give you a broad idea, luckily for me, for the landlord tenure variable, there is already an existing instrument in the well-known paper by Lakshmi Iyer and Abhijit Banerjee, which relies on the fact that the British used under certain kind of ideological influences in the 1820 to 1850s. I know there have been some criticisms of this instrument, but I'm kind of standing on the shoulder of giants and freely using it. Now that Abhijit Banerjee has won the Nobel Prize in economics, we can really not pretend that it's a good instrument because he must know what he's talking about. Unfortunately, for the princely state variable, there is an instrument in an article by Lakshmi Iyer, but it has certain flaws, which I can talk about in Q&A session. So one of the things I realized is that during this entire period that the British were annexing territories in India or signing treaties of indirect rule with various princes, they were also fighting these major wars in Europe, and which were probably creating both budget constraints and preventing them from fighting wars of annexation in India at the same time. So I used the frontier districts along the borders of the frontiers of the areas the British controlled at the time when, in India, at the time of the onset of major wars as an instrument, which is correlated with the choice of direct and indirect rule in India, but is probably not, but is exogenous to the choice to Maoist rebellion or other kinds of agrarian rebellions. And I published this in JCR, and I don't think we have much time, but if you look in the article, you will see that, yes, even after instrumenting for both princely state and zamindari land tenure system, my two measures are official and unofficial indirect rule, they are still statistics. They still have a positive correlation with Maoist insurgency. So roughly, it does seem that at least have some more confidence that these causal estimates are more causal and not just correlations. And the second issue, which I'm going to skip for now, is that there is this more detailed typology of princely states I have created, which is in chapter 6, and I'm happy to talk about it. It's kind of a novel empirical contribution, which those of you who are interested in South Asian colonial legacies might be interested in, but maybe I'll talk about it in the Q&A. What I want to do in the maybe 4 minutes I have left is, okay, I want to actually move on to the second part of the causal analysis, where I do process tracing using the two cases of Chhattisgarh and Andhra Pradesh, which are part of that southern epicenter of the insurgency. And here I try to do causal process tracing of the mechanisms from the 1850s all the way down to 1970s, relying on different kinds of qualitative data like historical archival data from the National Archives, various kinds of Maoist documents, and also interviews with the human rights activists, police, some Maoist sympathizers. I've actually interviewed a couple of Maoist leaders in jail, but there were kind of ethical issues with it because my father was in the police, and I have to talk about that later. So for example, there's this is a picture. I actually never get to talk because of the way my entire project keeps talking about history, and I realize I hardly talk about rebel agency. So this is a photograph of the counter-terrorism and jungle warfare college in the Kanker district in Chhattisgarh, which is one of the first southern districts in Chhattisgarh, which is Maoist affected. And it's run by Colonel Ponwar, who is this ex-army officer. I think it's the second actually such school in India. The first one is in Vairangte in the northeast in Mizoram, which MIM studies, that region of India. And the idea is, I don't think you can see it, but the motto is fight the guerrilla like a guerrilla, and basically train the fat, pot-bellied, inefficient police officers or junior level police in Chhattisgarh to actually behave like the Maoists and go in small groups and survive on eating snakes, etc., etc. Actually, I'm not even supposed to have taken this photograph, but I guess I took it when the officer was giving me data left, so I said I'm not going to have this opportunity again. But so here I'm going to focus quickly on the state of Chhattisgarh in 3-4 minutes I have left, and use it to elucidate the causal mechanisms. And actually, if you look at the southern epicenter of the insurgency, the PWG or People's War Group Maoists actually emerged in the neighboring state of Andhra Pradesh. That's where they were initially strong. So here, if you see actually at the level of violence, it's in Andhra Pradesh where the level of violence is higher much earlier. While in Chhattisgarh, they're much lower. But I would make a claim that what happened is like the PWG Maoists were pretty strong in Andhra Pradesh, and around late 70s, early 80s, some of them migrated here and say, let's cross the border into the state of Madhya Pradesh and see what's happening. and do some reconnaissance missions. And what they found is that you have these indigenous Gond tribes staying there, very weak state capacity, very few police posts, and many of the forest guards are harassing these tribals. So they started killing off or attacking the forest guards, started providing them protection. They started learning the tribal language, intermixing with them. And by the late 90s to early 2000s, even though the level of violence was low, I would claim in the southern part of Chhattisgarh, which was part of the largest state of Madhya Pradesh at that point, the Maoists had some of the strongest areas of Maoist control, almost base areas, with almost no police or Indian state presence. So what I want to do now in the next two slides is focus in or zoom in on the state of Madhya Pradesh, out of which the state of Chhattisgarh was created in the year 2000. It was the largest state in India at that point of time. And on the left, for example, you have the state of Madhya Pradesh around soon after Indian independence in 1951. And I think this is drawn from the census, and it shows you roads, railways, and maybe some electricity generating stations, which is a rough proxy of an important public good. On the right, you have the same exact area under British rule in 1909, drawn from the Imperial Gazetteers. The areas in pink are direct rule, and the areas in yellow are indirect rule. So you have the very large, relatively large feudatory state of Bastar and Kanker here. You have the small states of Surguja, Udaipur, etc. over here. And if we were to scribble a very inaccurate map of the state of Chhattisgarh, which was carved out of Madhya Pradesh in the year 2000, what do you see over here? If I were to stop here and I was to overlay these two maps, I guess the audience is probably muted, so I would like, what can you see here? If you want to take a guess, I don't know if you can actually see it. So this is Chhattisgarh. The areas which have Maoist control are here in Bastar in the south, and some in the northern epicenter in Surguja in the north. So if you were to overlay a map, a GIS map, what you would realize is that the districts of Bilaspur, Raipur, and Durg in the center, middle of Chhattisgarh, which historically had been part of British direct rule, had much higher levels of state capacity, had a much higher levels of electricity, while the areas in the north and south, which historically had been part of indirect rule through these feudatory states or different small feudatory states, had much lower levels of development. I'm going to suggest that this basically encapsulates the whole story, this diagram, that this story continues through part-dependent mechanisms. And the second mechanism, which you can see in Chhattisgarh, is that if you focus on that southern princely state, feudatory state of Bastar and Kanker, there were a lot of zamindari areas here, and the Maoists have been very strong in the zamindari areas of Putru over here. I don't think you can see it, Bhopalpatnam. And also officially, actually, in these areas, the Raja of Bastar was officially supposed to have these Khalsa lands under his control, and he's supposed to have officially collected land revenue directly, which is more supposed to have been like the Riyotwari system. In reality, as the British say in the archival documents, the Diwans on whom the Rajas were depending, the Diwans were the actual officials on whom they were depending, were the curse of Bastar. And for example, there's this Diwan Gopinath Kapurdar who introduced something called the Malguzari system, which is more similar to the Zamindari land tenure system. Many of these Malgudars were upper caste Brahmins from outside Chhattisgarh, and they really fleeced and exploited the land revenue and natural resources from these poor tribals. So I'm going to move on here quickly. So during my fieldwork, I basically found that these mechanisms persist. If you go to Chhattisgarh today, you'll find that even today, there are not as many police stations you have. Of course, today there are many more roads with the BJP government there. But the level of state capacity is still very low. And I use this representative interview in which I'm interviewing this deputy superintendent of police in Kanker district in southern Chhattisgarh, who says that in a batch of ASIs, the ASIs are assistant sub-inspectors of police, the best quality officers still not sent there. The toppers of the batch are not sent there. So it basically shows this bureaucratic mentality today in the IAS or Indian police service in India is not really very different from the bureaucratic mentality in colonial times, right? Because they still can, and these areas are considered punishment postings. So if you were a police officer, you would really be scared of being posted to Bastar, right? It's considered a punishment posting. Not much really has changed in these far-flung areas of India. And the state is willing to extract resources, but not really provide development. So I'm going to finish for some reason my slide is stuck. And the other mechanism which really persists is that you have a lot of landlords there. For example, I would illustrate this mechanism of part dependence through the example of Mahendra Karma. He himself was a tribal, and his father and grandfather had been part of landlords in the British times. And instead of helping the poor tribals, he was part of the Communist Party of India and part of the left. He joined the Congress Party, and he actually started the anti-Maoist vigilante movement called the Salwa Judams to prevent the Maoists from doing land redistribution. And he was later on finally killed by the Maoists. But this is a good example of why you have elites who want to actually prevent land redistribution because they come from upper caste and they have a lot of political power and political influence, which causes part dependence. So I'm going to skip these slides here and essentially I know, I'm sorry, I apologize, I've already gone over time. And so to cover, when we come to the Maoists basically re-enter Bastra by the 1980s, and they are able to create very strong base areas by providing various kinds of public goods like protection. They actually attack some of these police or forest guards, provide public good of protection to the Adivasis. Then they are also able to provide other kinds of things that they do. They start various kinds of mass organizations like the Dandakaranya Adivasi Kisan Mazdoor Sangh, and redistribute a lot of land, etc. And as a consequence, slowly and surely by the late 1980s, they are able to create these very strong areas of Maoist influence in these areas which historically have been part of the princess state of Bastar. I apologize, I've run out of time, so I'm going to quickly skim through these. So there are various policy contributions which I can talk about. Of course, there are many empirical contributions here, like I've created an instrument, I've also created different kinds of measures, dependent variable, etc. But the big real contribution of the project, which I like to flag, which would be of interest to this particular audience, would be that if you look at the Civil War literature, it's mostly historical. And what I'm trying to do is basically bring history back in some sense, especially targeted at the quantitative literature on Civil War, and trying to show that there are these deeper processes of state formation, starting with colonial institutions, maybe even pre-colonial institutions, and analyzing them, we can actually see what created this subnational variation in weak state capacity for subnational variation in ethnic inequalities in the first place. And doing that allows us to actually address some of the causal bias and endogeneity in the quantitative literature in Civil War. And also it allows us to explain conflict recurrence in some of these areas, whether in India or Latin America or Africa. So I'm gonna end my presentation here. And of course, there are various other theoretical contributions to the South Asian politics literature. For example, there's an established literature on Hindu-Muslim riots by Brass, Vashti Wilkinson. Lots of scholars like Shumi Ganguly or Paul Stanley study ethnic insurgencies. It's one of the first large comparative politics kind of studies of colonial legacies and civil war in India. So and then in chapter 10, I do generalization on Burma and Pakistan, but I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A session. And I'd like to thank Joseph for inviting me and to Min for being the discussant. I'm gonna stop talking here, and I really look forward to your comments and criticisms, and thank you once again.
Thank you, Chief. Okay, could you stop sharing? Yeah.
Stop sharing the slide here. And
okay. All right. Well, thank you for a very detailed and animating book presentation. And before we move on to Q&A session, which will be through the Q&A function in your chat box, I heard one or two questions already addressed. I'd like to respond on maybe a couple of things about your book. I love many things about your book as a researcher who studies colonial legacies, but I'll limit to just a few here. First, your argument that different types of colonial revenue institutions played a large role in generating conditions conducive for insurgency onset is powerfully articulated throughout the book. Distinct colonial past set up a different pathway for later ethnic and political entrepreneurs who could exploit the opportunity and emotive framework to initiate rebellion in some places, but not in others. And yet your story isn't just about structure set by colonial past. The rebel agency interacts with structural conditions set by colonial institutions to produce divergent patterns of civil war onset. Unlike other colonial origin theories that tend to picture human agency as being caged or being captured by the past, your book presents that human agency is not caged, but bounded by historical conditions. To borrow famous Marxist quote, men make their own war, but they do not make it as they please. Finally, I was very impressed with the breadth and the depth of empirical work on two Indian states, Andhra Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. They were convincingly illustrating your argument and show potential applications beyond India, such as Burma, Pakistan, and perhaps Africa and beyond. Due to a time constraint, I'm just gonna limit one question before we're moving on to the Q&A session. As I was reading your case studies, I realized that politics were quite pronounced in either within rebels and between state and the proto-insurgent groups in the start of the rebellion, which was kind of missing from your theoretical framework. A few things that I picked up on the political dynamics was either the Maoist political party losing the political power at the provincial level through an election, or disagreement between the extremist and moderate factions within the Maoist group, or the Indian government tried to co-opt some factions but not others. So I was wondering so my question is, how does the post-colonial politics either within rebels or state rebel may interact with your theory? That's the question, and please ask your question through Q&A session so that Chip can address it.
Great. I'm not muted. Okay, I can always say thanks. Thanks, Min. Thanks a lot and I apologize for going over time really. And hopefully I'll try to keep my answers short so that we can try to address as many questions which come up. And thanks for saying the nice things about the book. And yes, I do try to bring in rebel agency to some extent, but it's like most of these historical legacy arguments. Maybe I'm still open to the criticism that I don't do enough of it. But I do have a chapter on the chapter which I mentioned, chapter 4, which is kind of a standalone chapter. I actually realized like maybe at the all India level also I need to analyze what do the Maoist leaders themselves think of colonial legacies. And I actually analyze various Maoist documents, the main documents. I also have interviews with some Maoist sympathizers like Gaddar, who was this famous balladeer. He was an underground Maoist himself. He was shot a couple of times and he came overground and he created this Virasam. He's part of this overground intellectuals, come singers network, and I met him and I cite him and various police officers. And what I've especially found interesting in terms of rebel agency is that it is true. I don't know if the Maoists, if there was a Maoist leader, if Prachanda from Nepal Maoist, they think of the Indian state as semi-feudal and semi-colonial. And I have seen Maoist documents written on People's March, which is, I think, now a banned kind of online version of their journals where many leftist intellectuals write, where they actually have acknowledged the fact that areas where land reforms did not happen in Bengal or Kashmir did happen, it became more difficult for us. So they're kind of aware of it, but they don't use the exact terminology of indirect direct rule. There's also this famous, well-known document called Strategy and Tactics, which the Maoists, when they were unifying in 2004 to form the CPI Maoists, and I've actually gone through that in detail and I analyzed this in chapter 4. And it's fascinating. They said these are the areas which we have to target, Dandakar and Atistar, and these are the secondary base areas for these reasons. And we have economics. They actually do a lot of surveys. And if I have gone through them in detail and tried to show that most of these areas which they've outlined, the only ones where they have been successful are those where there has been some form of zamindari land tenure or some form of particular types of princely states. So I've tried to, I think rebel agency, of course, does matter a lot. But to some extent, they have been constrained to those pockets of India where there are these historically created inequalities. And so I'm gonna maybe I want to move on to the other question, which is like I love this quote. Like maybe I want to email men make their own war, but not. I missed writing the last part, so I'm going to email you for it. Maybe I'm going to use it later. And I'm going to come to your question. And your question is one of the things which you found potentially missing from this theoretical framework, if you were to go back to that very complex causal pathway diagram, which even I sometimes find difficult to follow, and it's changed a bit. The book actually has a slightly more complicated version, is that the politics is not pronounced and slightly missing from this theoretical framework. And you want me to talk a bit more about politics. And that's probably true because in the 2 chapters in Chhattisgarh and Andhra, I'm having to do a lot because I have to draw the historical causal pathways, the history, and then I have to talk about how the conflict persists, and then I have to talk about the Maoists are doing. So those paragraphs were about sections which are about the actual politics and what happens and how path dependence set in is not as long as maybe I would like it to be. And then I have to, because there's too much going on because it's multi-method. I think there are a couple of ways in which politics matter. The first way I think in which politics, and Ashu Varshney once told me, this long time back, is how about it, like, we don't care about colonial legacies or so. You tell us about, and I think the politics which matters is in this story, firstly about path dependence setting in. And this also has to do with the story of whether the causal argument is inevitable or not. And actually, the causal argument is not inevitable. My internet is saying that it's unstable, but can you hear me? Okay. So it's not inevitable because there are like Andhra Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, where the Maoists actually turned out to be successful. And I think the reason they were successful is because, as I was briefly touching on in the case of Chhattisgarh towards the end, firstly, many of these tribals, especially lower castes, they do not have as much representation in the major political parties. At least the lower representation, like they're represented in India through the Bahujan Party and some or other who work on Indian Indian politics can tell us more about this, but the tribals really have never really been well represented in Indian politics. So as a consequence, they will either join the Congress or the BJP, which is a right-wing Hindutva party. And even the tribal leaders who join them do not really represent the tribals. So there is a political party called the Prithak Bastar Party, which is like the Sons of the Soil. We want to represent our own tribes party, but it's never really been successful in Chhattisgarh. That's one of the challenges. And because of that, what happens is that many of these politicians in the Congress, historically the Congress in the 1950s and 1960s did not do enough land reforms, essentially. So for example, if you were to study the case of Andhra Pradesh, which is that big, large southern state, which I did not present on today, under the Nizam of Hyderabad, there was a lot of land inequalities which were created because it depended on Deshmukhs and depended on these Jagirdars, who were these feudal entities who had a huge amount of feudal oppression. And there was a rebellion even before the Maoists came along. In 1942-45, there was a big rebellion in the northern part in this region called the Telangana Rebellion. After that, India becomes the Congress party came to power, and they actually started some land reforms. For example, they started anti-Jagirdar, they abolished the Jagirdars. They started land tenancy reforms, but these land tenancy reforms were never really successful. And this is, I think, where the politics mattered. And I think I've written a little bit about this in the chapter on Andhra. And the reason for that is because many of these politicians are also from the Reddy or Kamma, this middle caste, or they're Brahmins, and the landlords are all the same caste. So they can easily prevent the politicians from actually implementing the land reforms. And that's one of the reasons why the Maoists, I've cited from Maoists, like, why did we have to restart the movement again? Why was the Telangana rebellion? It's because the Congress, the land reform process in the Congress was never really completed. So that's one way I think politics has mattered a lot. It's not inevitable, because in states like Bengal, in states like Kerala in the south, which I very briefly studied in another chapter, land reforms have been successfully carried out by the Communist Party of India, Marxist. And as a consequence, this is the part where the story is not inevitable. It's not structurally deterministic. If you can carry out land reform, politicians can carry out land reforms, then obviously there's not going to be Maoist dissent. And I think you also talked about disagreements between Maoist factions. So maybe I'm going to stop talking here because the other ways in politics is important, but I'm going to take up other questions from the Q&A, and I'll come back to some of the other questions you raised later.
That's a great idea. We have a few questions already raised, two from Professor Keith Darden and one from Manas Mehta. I think Keith was asking the first question about selection issue, which I think you already addressed a little bit, but I'm going to move on to Keith's second question, which I'm going to read it out. Presumably, the type of colonial rule affected a broad range of variables that might also be linked to the support for the insurgency. Could you talk a bit more about the literacy, language, or ethnic heterogeneity that might also vary across these provinces as a result of indirect rule?
Thank you. That's a great question, Keith. And we can briefly talk about this, the first question also. But so let me just quickly think of it. Let me talk a bit more about the literacy, the language, or ethnic heterogeneity, which also may have varied across these provinces as a result of indirect rule. Yep, I think colonial indirect rule may have. So let's just focus, say, on the case of Chhattisgarh, which I presented today, since I presented it already, and let me actually think through it off the cuff. And the areas which were part of that middle part, which was pink, Raipur, Bilaspur, and Durg, which historically had been part of the central provinces and under direct British rule, they had different ethnic groups staying there. They also had some tribals, but a lot of them there's been a lot of in-migration from outside and a lot of people from other neighboring states. While the areas in the south, in Bastar, the princely state which I was talking about, and the area in the north of Chhattisgarh, for example, which are these smaller princes, Surgaja, etc., they have different kinds of tribes. For example, in Bastar, if you talk about ethnic composition or ethnic heterogeneity, there are these small tribes. Most of them are Gond tribes or Koya tribes. And interestingly enough, historically, at one point, maybe in the 13th or 14th century, they used to have their own Gond kings, but many of the kings later on came from outside, from South India. The level of literacy, that would be a good question to go back in 1820, say 1750 or 1650, and see if there is a difference in level of literacy between the central districts of what is today Chhattisgarh and the southern and northern districts, which were partly indirect rule. But today, recently, I think because of indirect rule and because of ignoring these areas, the areas in north and south of Chhattisgarh, which was under the different kinds of feudatory princely states, are really, really lowest level of literacy. They have extremely high forest cover. Today, of course, things have changed because there's been more mobilization. The BJP has been there since almost 2000, and the languages are also very different. So I think that maybe there was already difference in terms of ethnicity, difference in the language, difference in terms of literacy. But because the British were building more roads in the central areas, as a consequence, there happened to be more development, more in-migration in the central districts of Chhattisgarh and Raipur, Bilaspur, those which were part of the central, part of directly ruled by the British as central provinces, while these areas continue to be neglected. And I have seen archival documents where after, this is actually the mentality of the Indian state, like the archival, in the southern part of Bastar, there are very rich natural resources. And I have slides there which I could not present. And I've seen some documents which are not there. I don't think I've included them in the book also, where there's correspondence happening between the Ministry of Forest, Environment and Prime Minister Nehru, and they realize that, oh, Bastar has these extremely rich natural resources, the bauxite, let's exploit them. And then there are these things, Ministry of Railways is saying, can we build another road? And another ministry responds, there's no need to build a road. We already have a road from the central part of near Raipur to the coastal area where we can extract it, bring the resource and extract it. So the colonial mentality kind of persisted, and that's why I think because of the difference in direct indirect rule, the level of development, level of literacy, level of I wouldn't say level of ethnic heterogeneity, but these things, the differences kept increasing. While they may already have been there from the beginning, indirect rule further intensified it. And very quickly to your question, I think that's the question. The first question which you asked was selection. No one's actually analyzed this, and there's a paper to be written here. I've tried to use an instrument of variable analysis to the extent you believe in instruments. It's not a bad instrument. There could be worse instruments than those. It actually relies on exogenous shocks to the Indian system from wars in Europe. But no one's actually analyzed what causes the choice. And there is an article by, I think, Dan Ziblatt and Daniel Ziblatt and others have written an article on a general level trying to predict what explains the choice of direct indirect rule. And they actually have a footnote which omits India. They drop India because it's true. So no one's actually analyzed this. So thanks for bringing that up.
Thanks, Shiv. We have 2 more questions before we end the session, and please ask more questions if you have more. From Menas Mehta, thanks for presentation. Your theory, unless I'm wrong, states that extractive colonial rule has led to the tribal and caste grievance in the regions of India where extraction is highest. I'm wondering how this theory diverges from Asimobula's book on why nations fail. That's, yeah, could you address that a little?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if I'm not wrong, I think Manis was in my class at Utara Mississauga in my Politics of South Asia class. Too bad that we can't see each other. We could say hi to him. Yeah, I think that's a great question, Manis. And so I do analyze in chapter 2. I actually analyze these different literatures, and there are 3 main literatures to which I make a contribution as I outlined in chapter 1. The first literature is the colonial legacies literature, another literature is civil wars literature, and then to the Indian civil war insurgency kind of literature. So I have not focused so much on the Darren Acemoglu Johnson Robinson book, but more on James Mehani and Atul Kohli, who focus more on colonial direct indirect rule in South Asia. And there is a debate within the South Asia literature here. Maybe I'll flag it briefly here. And the contribution here is like you have scholars like James Mehani, Atul Kohli, and actually Jim Mehani's student, Matthew Lang, who's at McGill. He's a sociologist, but he's written this book on British colonial legislative direct indirect rule, which is more of a qualitative case study comparing different regions also. And they basically find that areas with a direct rule had less extraction, had higher levels of development, to the extent that, of course, there was extraction, colonial extraction going on even in these areas compared to indirect rule. But there are other scholars like Lakshmi Iyer, who say just the opposite. And Lakshmi Iyer, who's a well-known economist, and she's co-authored that well-known paper with Abhijit Banerjee. But she has a separate paper in 2010 in World Development, where she analyzes just the formal kind of indirect rule and its effects on development. And she comes to the opposite conclusion from what I do. And she says that indirect rule areas were actually better developed. But she uses an instrumental variable analysis. Like there are some problems with her instrument. Her instrument does not cover the entire time period, actually. Let me explain that in detail. So in this debate, and then there's Ajay Varghese, who I think is building more on, he has a book in 2016 on colonial legislative conflict in India, and he has kind of an opposite prediction, and that like areas which are direct rule would actually have better outcomes. I think the problem, and I kind of try to resolve this debate, and I think the problem in this debate is most of these scholars, and Steve Wilkinson actually has critiqued this broader literature, and I had one of the slides very briefly, maybe I can try to share it again later. He says like the problem with us is there's so much more variation within types of indirect rule. And that's why I try to develop these different forms of indirect rule, especially formal indirect rule. There are these feudatory states like Chhattisgarh. And there are these successor states, like in Hyderabad, like in Bengal, who are descended from the Mughal Empire. These are the ones where usually the rulers are from outside ethnically, and there's high levels of ethnic inequality. While there are other kinds of states, for example, Mysore, where you've probably heard of Tipu Sultan, whom the BJP probably doesn't like in India. And they are warrior states, or the Marathas. And those princely states were warrior states and fought the British. They centralized the bureaucracy. It's like the war makes states kind of a theory, and they have low levels of land inequality. And that's my major intervention in the colonial legacies debate. To quickly answer your question about the Darun Asimobula, they talk about extractive institutions, right? They don't talk about direct indirect rule, the forms. And I would say that at least within the context of South Asia, we find that colonial legacies of indirect rule tend to, because the British are depending on intermediaries and are protecting them, the Indian people cannot replace these rulers even if they are inefficient. As a consequence, these rulers often tend to become despotic, not always, because there are some rulers who are not despotic. Like, as I mentioned, the warrior states or the Marathas. They are also despotic, but maybe slightly less than Hyderabad. So it depends on the type of princely state. And as a consequence, there is even a higher level of extraction happening here. So I think the broad argument, going back to their original article in 2001, about not only why nations fail, about like those in some institutions are more extractive than others, and how my colonial legacies kind of theoretical argument leads to there is, I find that colonial indirect rule institutions are relatively more extractive than colonial direct rule institutions within South Asia. Thanks, and thanks for the question, Manas. Great to have you here.
Shiv, we have one more question left before we finish the session. So maybe we can quickly address that. It's from Professor Boaz Atzili, SIS. Fascinating talk, thank you. One typical argument about the colonial legacy for state building in post-colonial state is colonialists because they impose an external rule and did not allow for indigenous development of administrative skills, left these states with no bureaucratic infrastructure once they gained independence. But your argument, it seems to me, makes the case that it is precisely where the Indians who are allowed a significant degree of autonomous rule is where we see the most troubles, inequality, etc. Could you address this tension in your theory?
Thank you, Boaz. That's a fantastic question. And I think that's exactly what I was trying to, I think maybe I can share a few slides if I can. And you're absolutely right that the literature on colonial legacies, which was summarized in chapter 2, even if we just focus on the colonial legacy literature of direct indirect rule, there's no consensus. And that's why I say, let me just focus on one region, because there's going to be so much variation between different regions and different colonizers. And maybe let me see if I can build an argument here and we can generalize later. That's why I focus mostly on South Asia, though I think some of these arguments might be generalizable to Africa and maybe in a different form. If you can do a little bit of conceptual stretching to some cases of leftist insurgency in Latin America. So I think your question is that in Africa, actually, the literature diverges. There are some scholars who recently found, like Blankton, Mason, and Atho, that the British was indirect rule, and the French, and there was more ethnic conflict. Then there's been a recent study by Cederman and his co-authors who find just the opposite, that indirect rule by the British actually had more inclusion. So the mechanisms are kind of very different, and it's a little complicated. So the mechanism which you're pointing out here is that they imposed colonizers wherever they imposed external and indigenous development administrative skills, and left the state with no bureaucratic infrastructure. It varies a lot, actually. Is that I've been trying to actually show that there are different. There's a much more. I think it shows my internet connection is unstable. Can you hear me? Okay. So I think the direct answer to your question is that there are some princely states in India, which was the more formal kind of indirect rule, which actually satisfy the first sentence which you point out, that if you let them do what they are like those warrior states in the West and South, like Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali, or the Muslim states, they would fight the British or the Marathas, fighting them, finally defeated. They kept defeating the British and finally defeated in 1820. Leave them alone, then obviously it led high levels of administrative capacity, high levels of administrative skills. On the other hand, there are other states, for example, the state of Hyderabad, which later on was part of the state of Hyderabad, became part of the larger state of Andhra Pradesh, which is my second case in chapter 8, which I was talking about, where the Nizam of Hyderabad ruled and created a lot of land inequality. this is what I would consider a successor state. And I'm basically borrowing from language from a historian named Barbara Ramsay, the princely states. And because they were from the Mughals and they tried to compete with the British, but they were not as strong, they could not. They were defeated, they became subservient, signed treaty of subsidiary alliance, and then they kept becoming dependent and weaker than the British, and they survived some of them, but they were not really as strong. They also, in these areas, the British often depended on these zamindars, or they are historically dependent zamindar kind of elements, and there was a lot of land inequality. So these would be the part of what you mentioned in your second sentence, where the Indians are where you see more troubles. So the answer is really very subtle, and I don't know if Min allows me. I don't know if I can quickly share my screen again, and I can show you. Can I do that, Min? There's this particular map which I can.
We are over time, but you could maybe quickly,
yeah. Yep. So I'm happy to share this with you first, and the answer to that depends on the particular type of princely state. And one of my big empirical contributions is I show that there's much more fine-grained variation within forms of indirect rule within India than previous scholarship on colonial legacies in South Asia have considered. Thank you.
I think that's all for today. Unless Joseph would like to say a few words, we could end the session here. And I'd like to thank Shivaji and Joseph and Kate and others who made this event possible. And thank you for the audience for attending this session very patiently. I'll say goodbye here then. Thank you, everyone.
I'd like to take the opportunity to say thank you to Min and Joseph and to the audience members for their excellent questions. And I'll be happy to take any questions. Maybe I'll continue talking with some of you over email if there are any other questions you have. So thanks a lot, Joseph, and thanks, Min, for your comments.
Thanks, Shiv.
Hope to see you guys in person sometime soon. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.